Hello, listeners. This is Tris G, broadcasting to you from the tower on the edge of nowhere. I'm in the process of packing, as this will be the last time I see home for a while. I'm about to take a road trip, and I'm taking you all along with me. I've been on it several times already, but due to the nature of nowhere, things change just a little more for the stranger every year. But I'm getting ahead of myself a bit. For those not in the know, which is most of you, how to explain what or even when or where nowhere is? Well, the first bit is sort of easy. It's a country. The where is the hard part. See, almost none of its population came here on purpose. Not even the native peoples who came to settle here. Nowea, as it's actually called, is a landmass estimated to be roughly half the size of the African continent, making it the biggest country literally no one has ever heard of. You might be wondering how such a big place manages to escape detection. Well, friends, if I could answer that, I wouldn't still be here. The western nowhere woods are a generally placid place. Eerily placid. Animals are rarely seen out this far, and birds seem to alter their flight patterns. Only thing bold enough to venture out this far and be relatively unbothered are humans. Starting at the southernmost point of the country, the nowhere woods encircles the western, southern, and eastern borders of the country, up to the country's halfway point, before terminating in the Algalar Mountains in the northwest and the Harlanon Swamp in the northeast. Go in any of the four cardinal directions far enough, and you'll hit a body of water we call the Blue Gate, or the TBG for short. Keep going further, and you'll end up on the opposite side of the country from where you started, with no other landmasses encountered on the way. This tower is close to the woods' western edge, thus marking the western border. Two major theories are it's either the afterlife or it exists in its own pocket dimension. Neither one has been officially confirmed. The key point here is that, regardless of where it may be, most generally never leave after they arrive. But I digress. The Western Woods has 3 roads leading through it, only one of them going to civilization, with the nearest town being Hondale, about 20 miles northeast of here. Road number 2 leads to the port west of here, down through the Benson Cliffs, to the edge of the TBG. As for Road 3, well, it isn't truly a road at all. As for road number 3, well, it isn't truly a road at all. Rather, it's a trail created by something inhuman, ending at a singular large cave. But that brings me to the point of my journey. See, a long time ago, a woman by the name of Gustava Benavides Herrera found herself here in nowhere. She claimed to be an explorer of note, found herself here in nowhere after she fell during an expedition to K2 in the 70s, forgot to secure herself to the rock face and fell straight off. Miraculously, she survived, and when she came to, she found herself here in nowhere. Over time, she began writing down a guide for those who wound up here. Gustava was a strange woman. Drank coffee only at night, day drank constantly, only wore one outfit, and always carried an axe. And that brings me to the topic of the tower. Gustava found herself here in the nowhere woods about 3 days after she arrived. There were 4 other people with her at the time. When she fell from K2, she took a few members of her expedition with her. There was Michael Harcroft, a trust fund kid who invested in something involving computers. He was funding the expedition. Not much else to say about him, except he was apparently an asshole from what I am told. Lucinda Marks, a geographer with an unhealthy love of sweets and expensive booze. At least a third of her supplies were these two things. Not really helpful going up a mountain, but she was good at what she did, so it was overlooked. That would come to work against her later, but not how you might think. There was also Connor Mendelsohn, a radio tech that Gustava brought along with her on all of her expeditions. Gustava never wanted to be in a situation where she couldn't call for help, thanks to faulty radios. Lastly was Jyoti Rao, Gustava's best friend. A fellow explorer herself, she and Gustava met in college, became inseparable, and promised they'd see the world together. Needless to say, she had been on many of Gustava's expeditions. It would be her name I'd hear being mumbled in Gustava's sleep. So there they were in a strange land, now low on supplies, and unaware that their situation was far more serious than they anticipated. And then they stumbled upon the tower. Call it fate, call it luck, but something about it called to them. The tower, as it's called, is an old watchtower that stands at roughly 150 feet, with smaller watch posts every 20 feet or so, each with their own searchlight, all of which were blocked by the time of my arrival. The base is made of a stony substance that has yet to be identified, with the rest of the tower being made of a steel cylinder. Of particular interest is the 3.5-foot thick blast door, which serves as the only way in and out of the tower. And at the highest watch point in the top is a small residential quarters with bulletproof glass windows, a searchlight with a 28-foot visibility distance at each of the four corners of the balcony, and inside is a small kitchenette, a couple of comfy couches, a bathroom with a shower and toilet, don't ask me how it works, a TV, and most importantly, radio gear. Despite the tower being of clear advanced age, it was clear that things had been added to it over the years by people who had come to it at earlier points. Their additions to it being the only remaining traces of them, as they had all long gone by then. One more thing. The strange symbols etched all along the tower's base. So, there they were, in this strange tower, in a strange land, and not even certain if they'd ever leave. A few months had passed, and they'd made themselves comfortable in their hopefully temporary new home. Connor had been plugging away at repairing the radio equipment when one day the radio picked up a signal. It wasn't clear, but someone was on the other end. Unfortunately, after a few seconds, the signal was lost. It was reasoned that perhaps the signal needed to be boosted somehow. Connor, being the best at what he did, and being emboldened by the day's results, resumed his work. Over the next week, the signal grew stronger and stronger, till the voice on the other end came in loud and clear. Everyone gave Connor the pat on the back he rightly deserved. Their celebrating was, unfortunately, short-lived. Now able to communicate with somewhere beyond the woods, they tried to determine who they were talking to. Before long, it became apparent that whoever they were talking to, that person was still located in the country. Granted, it allowed them to learn more about the new place they found themselves in, but that wasn't really what they were shooting for. It is, however, how they made first contact with Hondale, allowing them to trek into town and get supplies. Still, Connor worked harder and harder to boost his signal to beyond the bounds of nowhere itself. Then, the trouble really started. One night, a storm rolled in. The latest modifications on the tower had been made when lightning struck the antenna. Everyone, except Michael, was huddled around the radio. The power surge raced through the tower to the base. Michael, who was just outside the blast door, having a cig, was tossed from his feet when the sudden surge of electricity hit the base, and the material it was made of created a pulse. Only a split second, But shortly after, a second pulse raced up the tower, through the antenna, and into the cloudy night sky. That night, two things happened. They made contact with Switzerland and learned that the world had been looking for them, that the rest of their expedition mates didn't proceed further after all and returned to the base camp, that their families still had hope and were active in interviews with the global community. This is how I'm talking to you, listeners. The second thing was far more sinister. Somewhere in the woods, something woke up. Remember when I said that the Western Nowhere Woods was placid? Yeah, this event is why. Up until this moment, it was as populated with fauna as any other region of the woods. Shortly after the pulse, things started to get quiet. Not all at once, mind you, but sure enough, the animals began leaving. Lucinda was the first to take note of this. In a few days, this region of the woods was empty. It was a strange occurrence, but they had since come in contact with their home countries and were focused on trying to direct rescue efforts to their location. Efforts that were ultimately futile, of course, because nowhere isn't on any map, and they had no idea exactly where on a map nowhere might be. But their spirits were lifted all the same. Their families knew they were alive, and to them that was the most important part. Some had even come to talk on the radio. 2 weeks after initial contact with the outside world, everyone was startled out of sleep from the sound of the blast door closing. They heard someone talking joyously, greeting their mother outside, but no other voices were heard. Michael was the only one not with them inside. Before any of them could get to the balcony to see who he was talking to, everything went silent. Michael Harcroft was gone. At first light, they searched for him. No luck. No trace of him was found. But the next night, another strange thing happened. Lucinda and Jyoti found themselves out after sundown. They'd wandered further into the woods looking for Michael. Their search had been fruitless, and with the sun sinking below the horizon, the two decided that it was time to head back. Problem was, they were lost. Really lost. And in nowhere, lost is what you never want to be. They'd stopped to get their bearings when Lucinda decided then was a good time as any to have a drink. She had taken 2 large swigs from her bottle and was about to take a third when the trees started rumbling. Something was coming. Something large. Next thing she knew, her and Jyoti were racing through the woods, the large something hot on their tail. Night had fallen. It was getting harder to see. The woods turned every which way, and it was hard already for Lucinda to keep up, as Jyoti was younger and a faster runner. Still very much intoxicated, she tripped on a tree root, twisting her ankle. Jyoti turned back to get her. She had only barely gotten back to her feet when the trees started to part. The two didn't stick around to see what would emerge, of course. Now greatly slowed down due to Lucinda's ankle, their luck went further south when they encountered a pond, a really wide one. It was either cross it or meet whatever was chasing them. They could only hope it wasn't too deep. Running around it wasn't an option. The two began their trip across the pond, where it became apparent it was getting too deep, and Lucinda wasn't a strong swimmer, more so with a busted ankle, and Jyoti couldn't carry them both. Thankfully, the alcohol in Lucinda's system was preventing the pain from being too great. Still, they couldn't move forward, and they couldn't move back. So what could they do? That's when Lucinda heard a familiar voice. She dared not look around, but it grew louder, harder to ignore. Jyoti didn't hear anything, and much to her horror, she saw Lucinda heading back to shore. frantically clawing her way there, a look of elation on her face. Her words were slurred, but it was clear she was calling to someone. Who, Jyoti couldn't make out. There was no one behind them, and Jyoti figured their pursuer had given up the chase. The woods were still, and she felt it best to get her friend before she tripped and hurt herself again. They'd rest there and at home at sunrise. Lucinda had a head start and was about to reach the shore when the trees began to rustle again in a familiar way. Jyoti raced after Lucinda, and just before she could reach her, the trees opened up, and Lucinda was snatched into them. Still elated, still joyously calling out, slurred words and all. The sound of her only ending abruptly, 1 minute later. Jyoti was frozen with fear and unable to think straight. She heard someone familiar calling to her, but considering what just happened, she didn't budge. She dared not to. The trees parted once more, and she averted her eyes down to the water's surface, closed them, and waited for death. But strangely, it didn't come. She could hear it coming towards her. She could feel its breath, but for whatever reason, it didn't do anything. She kept her eyes down towards the water anyway. She wasn't as close to the shore as Lucinda was. She was about midway between the center of the pond and the shoreline, the water still coming up to her waist, and the horrible something was large enough to tower above her. The suspense was killing her. The water was freezing, and she almost wished the creature would swiftly end it. She slowly opened her eyes. Perhaps it had gone. What Jyoti saw reflected in the water's surface, to this day, only a handful of people know, and she would be unable to describe to others what she saw that night. It would be a while before she would regain her ability to talk, and even then, she wouldn't say much about it. The next morning, Gustava and Connor found Jyoti still standing in the same spot, eyes wide open in fear, still turned toward the water. Her skin cold as ice and growing discolored. The two rushed her back to the tower. Thankfully, the water wasn't so cold she suffered frostbite, but it did take some time for her body temperature to get back to normal. She remained catatonic, however, able to drink, able to eat, but unresponsive in every other way. Whatever happened that night, whatever she saw, Jyoti's mind couldn't rationalize it. They stopped going out at night. Connor would continue trying to get them help from the world during the day, while the other two slept. They were all reluctant to share what had happened to Michael and Lucinda, especially with zero confirmation that they were dead. At night, Connor slept. Gustava would watch for any sign of their lost comrades, each night more uneventful than the last. For a few weeks, this went on. Nothing strange, no hints of movement from the tree line. That is until one night, almost a month since the last incident, Jyoti bolted upright in bed, screaming. It was as if reality had just slammed back into her all at once, like her soul had finally returned from whatever dark place it had retreated to. Gustava left her post and raced to her side. Connor, now roused from his sleep, raced into the room and was glad that Jyoti had snapped out of her stupor. The rejoicing was soon interrupted. The searchlights had been ignored for too long, and a loud bang was heard at the door of the tower. Thinking it might be either Michael or Lucinda, Connor prepared to go downstairs and open the door. Jyoti implored Connor not to go. It was nighttime, after all. She begged and she begged. Now, Connor was a big man, and there weren't too many people that could take him in a fight. But he also knew Jyoti, out of anyone in that room, knew something was up. So he didn't go and open the door. Instead, he raced down to one of the lower levels and hopped on one of the searchlights. It was not long before the two women heard him scream the name of his wife Carolyn and the sound of his footsteps go down the stairs. Jyoti knew what was happening and took off down the stairs and made it just as Connor got the door open and stepped out. Jyoti immediately closed the door and locked it. Gustavo was 2 levels up on one of the searchlights, scanning the ground for Connor. And the last she saw of her trusted radio tech, he was seen following something. What couldn't be made out. He was still calling to Carolyn, his voice shrinking into the distance, and then stopped. And then there were 2. Just Jyoti and Gustavo remained. Only they had seen something and lived. The next day, Gustavo hops on the radio and gives the families a sanitized version of what has happened to their loved ones, always reassuring them that she was still hunting for them, still offering up hope that they were still alive somewhere. On some level, it was for them, and some level, it was for herself. It strengthened her resolve to find her friends, to discover their ultimate fates, and to stop whatever took them. The 2 women would compare notes. Jyoti would share what she could remember, but there was still a mental block she wasn't eager to take down. Who could blame her, really? And over time, a plan started to form, a risky one. During the day, they'd go into town and ask the local businesses if they needed temp workers. It is common in Nowhere for drifting day laborers to show up and do odd jobs, so no questions asked. If any job took too long to finish before nightfall, they'd stay in town, some instances for a couple days at a time. Now, you might be wondering why they just didn't stay in Hondale. Why return to such a dangerous place, such as the tower? And, put simply, it just never occurred to them. See, at this point, they hadn't been in Nowhere a year. It hadn't sunk in yet that once you're in Nowhere, far as I know, you're not leaving Nowhere. Now, don't get me wrong, Nowhere is not a hopeless place. Far from it. But if you're not native to here, it takes you a while to acknowledge that your previous life, whatever that might have been, is over. So, to Gustava and Jyoti, who hadn't been in Nowhere for very long, it was just a matter of time before they would be back home, back to their old lives. So the 2 used their earnings to buy a number of items. 2 used mannequins, 4 hand radios, 2 compact mirrors, a roll of duct tape, a wading pool, and because they figured they need a weapon and there are no gun shops in Hondale, they bought an axe. It wasn't much to go on, but they reckoned something prevented Jyoti from being attacked in the water that night. Maybe if they tried to recreate those conditions, they'd figure out how to stop the creature that was attacking them. Just before sundown, they placed the mannequins inside the wading pool and taped 2 of the hand radios to their backs. After filling the wading pool full of water and doing a quick sound check or 2, they went back upstairs. There was a long night ahead of them, and they had 2 hours left to spare, so they curled up on the couch and took a nap. They woke up a little past 9 p.m. Everything was still as they'd left it. The woods were silent with little hint of movement. It was time to try and get the creature's attention. So they grabbed their radios and began just talking. They talked about home, about their families, and about their thoughts on each other. They'd known each other a long time, and now of all places, they were acknowledging that maybe their friendship was deeper than they'd thought, that maybe they had feelings for one another. It was a conversation neither of them thought they'd have, but the both of them wished they'd had it sooner. Jyoti drew closer to Gustava on the couch, brushing her hair away from her ear. The energy between them was growing more intense by the second. Gustava awkwardly pulled Jyoti closer, their lips on the verge of locking together, when they heard a noise outside. Quickly, they ducked down out of sight and crawled to the rails, sticking their compact mirrors out and angling them in the direction of the sound. Sure enough, the trees opened up, as Jyoti described. Not like the usual way trees part of something large is moving among them, but as if they were trying to move away from whatever was approaching, but could only lean out of the way. Strong, sturdy trees, bending like living rubber. They waited for something, and sure enough, something finally emerged. It took them a sec to see what it was. There was a big gap just in the trees, but nothing was coming through. Then they looked at the ground. 2 fuzzy black tendrils slithered out into sight from the trees, each one terminating in a pulsating organ that made a low, droning, sucking sound that crept up the edges of the wading pool, into the water, and up the mannequins. The strange organs pulled back to reveal several small finger-like appendages. They explored the form of the mannequins for a bit, before hitting one of the radio buttons, triggering Jyoti's radio back in the tower. They quickly rushed to turn down the volume on Jyoti's radio, but as if it were confirmation something was amiss, the tendrils quietly left the mannequins and returned to the woods, the trees closing behind them. It was a bit past 11 when the tendrils left. Neither of the 2 women understood what happened. Gustava asked Jyoti if that's what she'd seen, if that's what had happened to Lucinda, and Jyoti said no. Yes, the trees had opened like before, but something hadn't come out. At least, not the same something as before. They waited 2 more hours before going to investigate. They couldn't understand what scared it off. Had it been scared at all? Maybe it found no suitable prey. Either way, they'd have to try another night. They had made their way back to the tower entrance when one of the radios crackled. They turned back, and nothing seems to have triggered the radio. But they heard it again, and then their blood ran cold. One of the mannequins was missing a radio. But how? They had just seen it minutes ago. They'd walked into a trap. Both turned to run for the door, but something was stopping Jyoti. She dared not look down, but she knew what happened. Gustava had already run to the entrance and grabbed the axe and was already making her way back, prepared to swing. With a quick yank, Jyoti was being pulled through the woods. What the tendril dragging Jyoti was connected to, she couldn't see. All she could see was Gustava, axe in hand, sprinting through the woods in hot pursuit. Up ahead, Gustava could see the tendril receding into a cave, and if Jyoti made it past the entrance, she wasn't coming out again. Luckily, Jyoti managed to grab hold of the entrance. There wasn't much time. Both women knew she'd lose her grip before Gustava could reach her. With all her strength, Gustava raised her axe above her head and hurled it as hard as she could. The axe flew swiftly through the darkened woods, coming within inches of Jyoti's foot, managing to cut the tendril and freeing her. The 2 embraced, and with nary a word, Gustava passionately kissed Jyoti, pulling her closer. Jyoti squeezed back enthusiastically, tightly. Tighter and tighter. Gustava was still riding the waves of the moment. She began to speak, but when she opened her eyes, they were met with a look of sheer terror. Before she had a chance to fully realize what was happening, Jyoti was ripped from her arms and disappeared into the darkness. Grabbing her axe, Gustava gave chase. The cave branched off into various tunnels, each one seemingly leading to endless others. Though she couldn't see, Gustava barreled on through the dark and damp, Jyoti's screams guiding her on, until her foot hit something and she fell. She felt around. It was a backpack, and reaching inside there was a familiar shape. A glass bottle. It was Lucinda's. The creature must have dragged her through that tunnel. Gustava slung the bag over her shoulder and continued on. Along the way, she found a wrench. It must have been Connor's, and next to it was a box of cigs that were definitely Michael's. Whatever it was that took them was waiting for her down the tunnel. Was there still time? Gustava didn't know, but she couldn't give up. It felt like forever, but eventually, she came to a large cavern with a hole in the roof. The moon shone in, barely illuminating the area. It didn't take long for Gustava to realize she was being watched. She looked up and saw Jyoti hanging limp in midair. The horrible creature that had her loomed over Gustava, its shadow oppressive and heavy. Its full form was shrouded in darkness, but its eyes, or what was assumed to be them, glared down at her angrily, hatefully. It knew that she was the one who had maimed it. Jyoti stirred, and Gustava called out to her. The creature turned its head to her, and the droning, sucking sound they'd heard before resumed. It grew louder and louder. It felt like the pressure in the room was increasing. The creature moved its hand to a nearby boulder and pushed it away, revealing a bright, sickly pink light. And with a swish, it tossed Jyoti into it, and then the light was gone, leaving behind only her glasses. Was it rage? Was it heartbreak? It was probably a mixture of both. Gustava clutched her axe as she started swinging, and once she started, she didn't stop until the creature threw her back against the near wall, knocking the axe from her hand. Gustava frantically felt around in the dark for her weapon. The creature had started moving forward to her, and Gustava desperately held aloft the only thing she could get her hands on, the compact mirror she'd used earlier. This stopped the creature in its tracks. It covered its eyes and retreated back. That was all that was needed. Her axe now back in her grip, Gustava got a running start, leapt into the air, and buried the axe into the creature's forehead. It writhed and shook, trying to dislodge its attacker, but Gustava refused to let go. She couldn't hold on forever. Her grip was loosening, and with one lucky swipe, the creature flung her to the ground. She hit the floor of the cavern with a massive thud, losing consciousness. And when she came to, the sun was shining through the roof. The axe was lodged in the ground not far from her head, and the creature was gone without a trace. And worst of all, she was alone. She gathered her friends' possessions and looked for any others that might be left, and quietly found her way out of the cave. It was early morning. The sun beamed down through the trees, but no birds were singing, and no insects were buzzing. Nothing but the sound of her footsteps going through the vegetation. She found a small clearing near the tower and buried her friends' possessions, but Jyoti's glasses she kept. After that, she climbed the steps to the tower, which felt longer and higher than any mountain she had ever scaled. And when she arrived at the top, she went to the radio. With a lump in her throat, she contacted everyone's families. She told Connor's new bride her husband wasn't coming home, told Lucinda's little boy his mother wouldn't be home by Christmas, or any other Christmas from then on. Michael's mother was beside herself with grief and rage, shouting curses at Gustava before falling silent. But when it came time to tell the Rouse about what happened to their daughter, Gustava couldn't bear it. She told everyone to call off the search, and, as far as the outside world was concerned, on June 14th, 1978, Gustava Marisol Benavides Herrera gave her final broadcast and was never heard from again. Something inside her died that day. she screamed till her throat bled. And when she couldn't scream anymore, she cried. And cried and cried, till her eyes were so swollen she couldn't see out of them. And she blamed herself. She remembered the night before their fall. Now, sapphic women have always been a thing. It just wasn't an idea Gustava had encountered growing up in her small hometown in Argentina. And with how busy she was, romance never factored into her day-to-day life. But on this night, I guess something was in the air. Everyone on the expedition was just talking about their love lives and drinking, perhaps more than is wise, given what they were about to do, and someone made a joke about Jyoti being Gustava's girlfriend. I won't repeat it here, as it was the 70s and very inappropriate by today's standards. It was something she vehemently denied. But that night, as they were turning in, Jyoti, who had difficulty staying warm, snuggled up behind her and wrapped her arms around her tightly. They'd done this many times before, since college, and there wasn't any meaning placed on it before. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized Jyoti often had problems staying warm, regardless of the season. And then it clicked. And Gustava remembered how, for the first time, she felt her heart race. How she noticed how soft her longtime best friend felt against her. How it was the warmest, safest feeling she had ever had in her life. And then sadly, she remembered how she was daydreaming about it all when she forgot to secure herself to the rock face and fell, dragging the others with her, damning them all to the fate they would suffer. Guilt turned to sadness. Sadness gave way to depression. And if you've been listening up to now, you know things weren't over yet. In fact, it was just the beginning. At first, there were just strange rustling sounds in the woods. Still, no animals or people. This went on for about a week. Then came the pressure. It started off slight, then increased. It was as if someone was taking their fingertips and tapping repeatedly on her skull, trying to get in. But over time, those taps got harder and more aggressive. After about a month of the worst headaches ever, Gustava let the pressure in. And then it stopped. Then one night, after that, she heard a knock at the door. She raced down to see who it was, and what she heard was a familiar voice. It was Jyoti's. Gustava opened the door, and all that awaited her were the quiet sounds of the woods outside the door. And this kept happening with increasing frequency. Sometimes it would be at the door or below the balcony, always calling to her, and there was always nothing there. Every night her agony would be renewed, and then it dawned on her what was happening. She found her way back to the mouth of the cave and screamed. There was no sound but her echo. But the voice kept coming back, over and over for months. She knew that thing had returned, and it was punishing her, and it eventually broke her. So as before, she went to the cave, fell on her knees and begged for it to come and take her, for it to end her suffering. But unlike before, this time she got a response. Deep from within the cave, she heard it laughing in Jyoti's voice, ridiculing her. She'd scream, it'd scream back. She'd cry, and it would laugh. It would mock her, insult her. Every night she'd return and beg, and it would berate her more cruelly. But you can only keep a good woman down so long. On the final night of August, as the moon hung high in the sky and the wind raced through the trees, Gustava returned to the cave, and the voice began its usual routine. But this time she cut it short. If it wouldn't kill her, then she would kill it. No matter how long it took, she would get her revenge. And the voice cackled, but Gustava didn't care. She marched back to the tower, packed her things, and she went out to do what she did best, explore. And that started her trips out into nowhere, searching for some way to kill that thing. And a book began forming of her travels, of the things she'd seen, of the adventures she'd had. Every time she'd return with just a little more knowledge, and the creature would start getting even more bold. It would leave the cave and hunt Gustava, and she would hunt it right back, axe in hand. For years the two would do battle in the Nowhere Woods, each one becoming more scarred than the encounter before. And in time, Gustava's raven black hair turned a snowy white, her face more wrinkled, her hands more gnarled. But her brain, that remained sharp and alert as ever. She'd protect any travelers coming into the woods. The road to the cliffs only exists now because Gustava prevented the creature from attacking the workers. Every step of the way, she hounded this thing. And in the quiet times, it would still come to torment her. Then, about 16 years ago, something different happened in the woods. Yours truly dropped out of the sky. I had somehow managed to climb to the top of the Space Needle, intent on shoving off this mortal coil, and I'm sure to anyone back home, that's exactly what I did. Sorry, Mom and Dad. Last thing I remember is falling headfirst towards the pavement. Instead of my brain matter being exposed to the open air for any passerby to see, I found myself in the western Nowhere Woods at the base of this tower, and Gustava standing over me sipping a cup of coffee and shaking her head. She got me to my feet, and we headed towards the tower. I asked her about the symbols on the base. She paused for a moment, as if trying to formulate an answer to a question she'd never contemplated herself. But before she could speak, the trees began moving. She grabbed me by the arm and threw me inside, hurriedly locking the door. After rushing me up to the top, she switched on the nearest searchlight, trained it on the part of the woods we had just been standing in, and watched it the whole night, not moving from her post till morning. To this day, the look on her face at what she saw will haunt me. It was a mixture of extreme rage and sadness. She never answered my question about the symbols. Just as well, I'd find out in due time. I don't know what it was. Maybe something about my situation reminded her of herself. Maybe she was lonely and needed a friend. Or maybe she knew she wasn't going to be alive much longer and didn't want that thing out in the woods to win. But she quickly got me up to speed. So there I was, the newest soldier in Gustava's war. She was always careful to make sure I never encountered the creature, so most of the time, I never saw it, never heard it, never even got a single hint it was near, outside of Gustava's nightly watches. And she'd talk to it, and they'd have conversations. I only ever heard one end of it, and for the longest thought she was just a crazy old woman. But after accompanying her on her trips, I realized there were things in Nowhere that made our mission make more sense. About 5 years after I arrived, we were on our road trip when Gustava got a strange lead. In Nowhere, there are communities of people not from here who never accept their surroundings. They believe that there's a way of leaving Nowhere, that getting home is possible. We call them out-of-towners. Now, most of the time these people, while nice more often than not, have a tendency to latch on to strange rumors. The stranger, the better. 2 such rumors sprouted up in their communities that got Gustava's attention, and when something got her attention, it was best to look into it. Interdimensional crossovers are something discussed often in Nowhere, but only in reference to the often horrific events caused by them. But rumors started circulating among the OOTs that there was this interdimensional sub-network called the Ulu Zone, named after Carl Ulu, the only man allegedly to have entered it and returned. He claimed that time and space moved differently inside of it, that he went in as an old man, was imprisoned for centuries by the entities of this world, escaped, and returned a young man, claimed the water grants youth. But what got the OOT's attention were his claims that he would be taken to different dimensions via different portals. For a group of people who still believe they can go home, these stories were a big deal. The second rumor was that back in the 30s, there was a businessman named Martin Trasden, who after winding up in Nowhere, built a vast business empire and was soon the richest man in Nowhere. This tracks, as several products in Nowhere to this day bear his name. But rumor has it that he was into the occult and was obsessed with eternal youth. Makes sense? What good is being rich when you can't take it with you? So allegedly he would go out into remote places of Nowhere, supposedly where its ley lines were the most potent, and would erect structures on them. And then one day, as legend has it, he just disappeared. His children ran the company almost into the ground, only for his great-grandchildren to revive it, albeit at a more diminished level. The family never shared Martin's interests, but the structures are supposedly still out there. Gustava had been hearing about all of this in whispers off and on for years, but one day we'd found ourselves in the wandering library of arcane knowledge when Gustava stumbled upon a book of glyphs, and inside she saw the ones on the tower. Turns out they're meant to facilitate traveling to other planes of existence. One area would send out a signal, and another would serve as a receiver, opening an interstice in the fabric of reality. And then an idea formed. What if Martin knew about the Ulu Zone, used his structures to gain access to it, and then got lost inside? Or worse yet, something kept him from leaving. So Gustava hunted for Carl Ulu to see what he knew. He hadn't seen any other humans, but he could describe the creatures that kept him prisoner. They were towering creatures that from the waist to their neck were humanoid, covered in eyes. From the neck up, they looked like haggard dogs with 2 bulbous red eyes. From the waist down, they were a mass of legs with 2 prehensile tendrils. And when she heard that, Gustava's eyes widened. These creatures were called the Amoteth, and they'd keep beings from other dimensions they visited as pets, using the strange properties of the waters found in the zone to keep them alive. The Amoteth are incredibly vain and arrogant, requiring near constant adoration, but they're incredibly ugly, so they lure their victims in by accessing their minds and projecting out a vision of the person they treasure the most, and mimicking their voice flawlessly. The victim, being flooded with feel-good chemicals, is unable to see the trap. Darkness aids this purpose even more, and when they're caught, they're taken into the Ulu Zone and imprisoned. But Amoteths can't stand to be challenged on anything. Their arrogance won't allow it, and their vanity is quickly shattered by their own reflection. It's why in Amoteth hives, there are no reflective surfaces, and they don't look at each other, preferring to receive compliments from the slaves of their hive mates. And they don't automatically have access to your mind. They often get in at points of great stress or vulnerability. They're actually silent. The droning sucking sound heard is actually them trying to get into your head. A particularly strong-minded person can resist, or if the creature doesn't know you exist, it can't lock onto you, which is why I never seemed to experience any of the things Gustava did for so long. Now we knew why Jyoti wasn't taken at the pond. She was standing in a giant mirror and was too afraid to be tricked, and why Gustava got the upper hand in her first fight with the thing in the woods. An Amoteth had been granted access to nowhere by one of Trasden's structures, only coming out at night because it was easier to trick and snatch her companions. It couldn't get Jyoti when she was with Gustava because Gustava was her favorite, so it had to resort to regular trickery. We ended our trip there and raced back to the tower. Gustava was ready to end this, once and for all. When we got back, Gustava took me into the cave, to where she first fought the Amoteth, and sure enough, on the walls were the same glyphs. We knew then and there what we had to do. Gustava called in a few favors. We got several sticks of dynamite, a few full-body mirrors, some rope, and a couple pulley systems. It took us months because we had to work in such a way that the Amoteth wouldn't get wind of what was happening. But we set up the cavern with the mirrors, even at the expected point the Amoteth would come through, and we rigged it, every major tunnel, and the entrance of the cave itself to blow. The idea being, the creature would be unable to leave the cavern because it wouldn't be able to get past its own reflection, and then we'd bring it all down on top of it while simultaneously severing any possible interstice locations in the cave for good. On the final day, just before nightfall, we had a feast. I'd never eaten so well since coming to nowhere, and it was the only time I had ever seen Gustava relaxed and at peace. From a drawer in the kitchenette, she pulled out a bottle of scotch. Not my drink of choice, but it was Lucinda's, so I made an exception. We toasted to our mission soon coming to a close, and walked out to the balcony. With the sun still high in the sky, she told the story of how she ended up here. The same story I've shared with you, listeners. And I remember I turned to her, asked if she still thought her friends were alive. Jyoti would be Gustava's age at 70. Lucinda would be 85. Connor, 62. And Michael, 57. Gustava looked at her drink for a sec, looked over at me briefly, and then went inside and resumed drinking. Night would be here soon, and this would all be coming to an end. I remember waking up just a little bit after we were set to head out, and discovered Gustava was gone. Her gear and her axe as well. She'd gone without me. On the table was a note simply saying, "Goodbye." I pulled on my shoes and ran to the cave. It was dark, and I was a little hungover, but I ran as if the devil was chasing me. I couldn't believe she'd done that. I dashed into the cave, to the cavern, and sure enough, the mirror trap had been sprung. And then I saw it. Only briefly, but I saw it. The Amoteth, larger and even more hideous, flailing wildly, and Gustava with a death grip on its face. Next thing I knew, it ripped open the interstice and dove into it, Gustava still hanging on. I managed to snap out of my daze long enough to see Gustava's axe lying on the ground. I almost went in after her, but someone had to stay behind and trigger the explosives. Still, if my friend was going to do battle with interdimensional creatures, she needed her weapon. I took her axe, threw it into the interstice, and then ran back to the entrance, got to a safe distance, and triggered the explosives. Some of the debris flew and hit me in the head, knocking me out. Thankfully, it didn't kill me. I awoke the next morning and returned to the entrance, And sure enough, it was blocked by fallen rock. Hopefully, the inside was too. That was 11 years ago. I never saw Gustava again. I don't know if she got her axe. I don't know if she saved her friends. Don't even know if she's even still alive. If she really did end up in the Ulu Zone, anything is possible, I guess. But she'd be 81 right now, so I'm not holding my breath. Still, I've kept watch for any sign we weren't successful. I sit in front of the cave ready, but so far, nothing happens. There's been no movement in 11 years. More people venture into the woods these days on their way to the TBG, but still no animals. This year's road trip is different, though. You see, a few months ago, I started receiving strange photos to the P.O. box we had in Hondale. Photos of pillars stretching like broken fingers into a starless sky. Huge temples with strange, large entrances and rivers of glowing pink fluid. There were many more, but I never knew who sent them. But every month, I'd get another. And another. I'd hear on the news about strange structural collapses in abandoned towns, sinkholes in the prairies not far from weirdly placed derelict water towers. These events weren't frequent and were spaced pretty far apart, but it always got me to wondering. And then last month, I got one more photo. But it wasn't like the others. It was a photo of two women, both looking to be about 30, 35. One, a short Indian woman with long, curly black hair and glasses, and the other, a tall Argentinian woman in a familiar outfit, clutching an axe in one hand and the head of an Amoteth resting at her feet. Both were standing near what appeared to be a house that had imploded into its own basement. A tall, brown-haired man in his late 20s is inspecting the wreckage, while a younger 20-something man with blonde hair and a scrawny physique has a cig in the background. Obviously can't see their photographer. The two women appeared to be very, very happy. I got no more photos after that, but this morning I saw a red-horned deer in front of the tower, so I think that's as good a sign as any. Well, listeners, time to begin my trip, and I hope you'll come along with me. If this reached you, thanks for listening. Hug the ones you love. And until next time, this is Tris G, signing out.